What is going on, everybody? My name is Michael Levan. Thank you so much for joining me as always. And today we are going to kick off the Cloud Computing Getting Started playlist for AWS over here on YouTube. Now, this first video, we're going to talk about what data centers look like, what it looks like in AWS. So we're going to think about the architecture and how it differs, what you actually have to manage. And then we're going to dive in a little bit and talk about the benefits of cloud computing versus on-prem. Because yes, in reality, there are pros and cons to both. So with that, let's go ahead. We're going to dive right in. All right, so on my screen here, we have essentially like a standard data center, right? Like what it's going to look like. Obviously, how many routers and switches and firewalls and all that stuff that you have, all that is going to differ, of course, but this is essentially the gist, right? So we have some routers, we have some switches, we have some firewalls, we're getting out to the internet, we have servers, probably groups of servers if you're doing different types of scalability. And here's the reality. It all looks the same in the cloud, but here's the biggest difference. All of this hardware, all of the routes, everything, you have to manage yourself. Everything down to what ISP you're using. And by the way, you should have a couple ISPs. You should never just rely on one main line. So then you have to set up all of the configurations for that as well. There's pros and cons. You know, it's nice to be able to control your hardware, how it works, what components you're using, all of that stuff. Because really, this is where like raw engineering and systems administration comes into play, because you have the ability to control everything, the routes, how they look, how they work, what servers you use, all of that stuff. When you're in the cloud, you really don't have that all that much. Now, another aspect that I hear a lot is around security. So a lot of people say, well, you know, because we can own it ourselves, we can properly secure it. Well, I'd actually argue that it probably not as good as AWS, for example. The thing that you have to remember is a lot of organizations like AWS, for example, have extremely large security departments. Probably where you work, I guarantee you maybe have one or two people, if that. Because security, especially in like, you know, the software development realm and all of that, is kind of looked at as like an afterthought, or, you know, there's one cloud engineer on the team that just so happens to enjoy security and they're the security guy or gal. With that being said, AWS would essentially have a ton more security people than most organizations. Now, I'm not saying all organizations, because there are organizations that are dedicated to security. However, in 9 times out of 10, most organizations, AWS is going to have far more security people on the ground than a typical organization would. Rant time is over, but the thing to remember here is that if you're thinking about it from a security standpoint, you got to kind of look a little bit deeper, I would say. Now, if we're looking at this architecture, this is a really cool tool, by the way. If you haven't used it, it's called Cloudcraft. It's to essentially create blueprints for AWS, but I enjoy it because it has like this 3D section where you can actually toggle it and then it just looks like a regular, architecture diagram. But the 3D is actually really cool. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. Now, a few of these components you're probably not going to know yet, and we're going to go over all this, so don't worry about it. But S3, you can think of it like storage. CloudFront is just a CDN. Elastic Load Balancing, load balancers. Route 53 is DNS. Elastic Load Balancing, again, load balancing. RDS is for databases. So, point being, all of this stuff that you see here, it's a lot of hardware, a lot of servers, and a lot of routes, and a lot of networking, and a lot of architecture. But here's the key. All of this stuff, you don't have to manage the hardware layer. The software layer, the services, like S3, for example, you have to manage what it looks like, what's in it, the encryption, etc. But you do not have to manage the hardware. And that's kind of where the cloud shines, because you got to kind of think about it from, I guess I like to think about it from like a resource standpoint. So let's say in a data center, say you run a data center, you have to have storage folks, you have to have network specific folks, you have to have server specific folks, maybe some Windows server, maybe some Linux server folks, you have to have virtualization people. From a resource standpoint, there are a lot of people that are needed to get it all up and running exactly how you want inside of a data center. However, in the cloud, it's a little bit different because you still need to have networking people, you still need to have storage people, etc. But because you don't have to manage that hardware, it's definitely a little bit easier. Now, don't hate me for saying that because I do come from a sysadmin background. Like I've spent plenty of nights sleeping on a floor in a data center. I've done all of that and I've done all of the cloud stuff. And what I could tell you from my personal experience is the cloud does make things easier from a hardware standpoint. And really all you have to worry about is like the technical stuff, you know? So for example, let's say you were gonna put 3 new firewalls in a data center. Well, you'd have to worry about the hardware, where you're buying it, how long it's going to take, does it work together, the operating system on the hardware, like is it, you know, an ASA, for example, where you have to know Cisco iOS, all of that stuff. And then finally, you have to configure it and do the routes and all that stuff. In AWS, well, you kind of like don't have to worry about that. You kind of just open up the service and you say, oh, I need this route to go here, boom. And then AWS kind of does the magic in the background. So with that being said, it is arguably a little bit easier. So now that we kind of have a high level here, let's dive into why the cloud is important in today's world. And we kind of already touched it, but let's go ahead and just talk about it a little bit deeper. All right, so let's talk about what the cloud is and why it's important in today's world. So first things first, what is the cloud? Long story short, someone else is managing your hardware. You're literally doing everything else. You're setting up routes, you're setting up services, you're deploying software, you're doing all of this. Someone else is just managing the underlying components, and it's an entire multiple employee job in itself. So it's actually good that AWS is handling that for you. So you manage the software layer. What I mean by that is, let's say you have, I don't know, applications running on Linux. Well, you would spin up some EC2 instances and you would actually spin up those servers. Now, you don't have to worry about the underlying hardware. You don't have to worry about any virtualization, etc. You just spin up the server and then you can SSH into the box just like you would any other Linux box. So why is the cloud important? I would say there's 3 primary reasons. Number 1, again, the abstracted hardware. You do not have to worry about hardware anymore. You still have to worry about the services, software, scaling, all of that, but you don't have to worry about the underlying hardware. You don't have to worry about setting it up. You don't have to worry about buying it. You don't have to worry about figuring out where it's going to live. You don't have to worry about the juice falling on it because in a lot of organizations, the server rack is just in a random closet somewhere with the rest of the kitchen supplies. So you don't have to worry about anything like that. You just have to worry about the services and the operating system. Next, again, you focus on the services. So let's say you're using EC2 or you're using, S3, for example. S3 is to store things. It's pretty much just storage. Well, you don't have to worry about all of the back-end storage components. You just have to worry about the encryption and putting your storage into S3. And of course, who has access to it. And the third thing is, honestly, from a business standpoint, it is less of an overhead for employees. So long story short, you don't have to hire as many people. It's just the reality that the world that we live in today, a lot of DevOps engineers, a lot of cloud engineers, etc., SREs, doing a little bit of everything. So you kind of have to hire less people. Like there's really not a, for example, we used to have like storage administrators, storage engineers, people dedicated to storage. Now you don't really see that too much. Like you're not going to just have an S3 expert and all they do is S3, for example. So it's definitely less of that. However, at organizations like AWS, they of course still have these specific people like storage engineers, because here's the thing, they're the ones doing that work now while you don't have to. So with that being said, I would say those are the biggest things of why cloud is important in today's world. It's less of an overhead. You get to focus on more of the services and the software versus the hardware. And from a business standpoint, you kind of have to hire less people. So with that being said, really appreciate you watching. Hope that this video helped. And in the next video, we're going to get started from a hands-on standpoint and really diving into AWS. Thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you again next time.